My name is Maureen Lamb. Today we're going to be talking about teaching outside the canon, Cornelius Nepos's Hannibal. And this is just one of many statues of Hannibal. Now, Hannibal was the famous Carthaginian general during the Second Punic War. So as an enemy of Rome, you would think that if there were to be a betrayal of him, it would not be very flattering. But on the contrary, Cornelius Nepos's betrayal of Hannibal is actually extremely flattering. He calls him the bravest of men, and he says that while the Romans are the greatest in terms of virtue, he excels all generals in terms of his wisdom. So clearly, Hannibal was someone that the Romans respected, even if they did not agree with him. And why did we read Hannibal? Well, it's about a general from North Africa, and it is in Latin. And Cornelius Nepos's Latin is very simple and easy to read, and really reminds me a lot of Caesar. And it's just a much more fun topic, I think, to read about Hannibal and what exactly happened. And this coin I really like because of the elephant on the coin. He famously had an elephant, perhaps called Sura, who was a bigger elephant than the other elephants in his army, and he would watch the battles from the back of his big elephant. Carthaginians also come up in the Aeneid. Aeneas and his men spend quite a bit of time in Carthage. And so talking about Carthage and the Carthaginian culture a bit in Cornelius Nepos's Hannibal is a good introduction to this. And it sets up the animosity between the Romans and the Carthaginians, which is alluded to in several places in the Aeneid. This is pretty cool. Even as a child, his father fought in the First Punic War, his father Hamilcar. And as a child, he wanted to go to Spain with his father, but he was required to make a sacrifice and vow that he would never be a friend to Rome first. And so this is a very dramatic picture of him. So he goes from where he lives in Carthage in North Africa to Spain, which is at this time partially colonized by the Carthaginians, and they're going to take over more of Spain. So he's from Carthage at first, and then he fought in Spain. While he was in Spain, his father Hamilcar died, and then his brother-in-law Hasdrubal took over, but then Hasdrubal also died. So at the age of 25, Hannibal took over the Carthaginian army. He made the bold move to march on Italy, and he decided he was going to cross the Alps with his army and perhaps his elephants. I went down a rabbit hole looking and seeing if there was any real evidence for elephants crossing the Alps, and I could not find any substantial evidence, but it's an interesting idea, and this is a very vivid picture of what that might have looked like. Hannibal also lost an eye due to an infection in Italy. He and his men were forced to make camp in a swamp for several days, and as a result, the swamps were full of all sorts of germs, and he got an infection in his eye, and because he insisted on being with his men, he lost his eye eventually. And so as a result, he showed his loyalty to being among the soldiers, but at the same time suffered a personal loss by having his eye taken out. And there are some really compelling episodes within this text. So when he was caught by Fabius Maximus in the Ager Falernus, he and his men had the low ground. They were surrounded by Romans on the high ground. And so what he and his men decided to do was to tie flaming sticks to the heads of cattle, to thousands of them apparently, as a diversion. And so then they sent the flaming cattle at the Romans and they were able to escape, which is a really vivid picture. When I assign these sections to my students, I often have them draw cartoons or create pictures so they can demonstrate their comprehension. It's very interesting and compelling. Also, Hannibal was responsible for the Romans' greatest defeat at Cannae, where the consul died, Aemilius Paulus, and then you have here the Battle of Cannae. So you have the Romans in red here, and you have the Carthaginians here in blue, and they just completely ended up surrounding them. So they came around this way and just surrounded the Romans. It was the greatest defeat that the Romans had ever experienced. As many as 50,000 Romans died in one day. And I believe not so many people were killed again in a battle in one day until I think it might be the American Civil War. So a really long time before a death on that magnitude was seen again. It's also interesting that we'll go back one second, the Battle of Cannae here was 1773, and the idea that the Romans were losing here and the kind of heroism of the Romans, it makes you wonder, like, was there some ties here to the revolution or what's going on here? So it's interesting topics here. Also, after the Carthaginians eventually lose, he does not lose a battle in Italy, according to Cornelius Nepos. However, when Hannibal rampages through Italy, but then he's recalled to defend Carthage, and he loses at the Battle of Zama. And afterwards, he is made a magistrate in the government and actually in charge of paying retribution to Rome from Carthage. He becomes largely kind of isolated, though, from the Carthaginians eventually, and eventually has to leave. There's some ill will there. And so he goes and he fights for other people who are going to fight against Rome. And probably his favorite thing that he does is in a naval battle, he is vastly outnumbered by, I believe it's King Eumenes II. And so he decides that rather than fight in a normal way, because they're so outnumbered, he's going to have the soldiers put snakes in jars and throw snake bombs at the other ships. This is compelling stuff. This is really interesting. And so the snake jars, my students had a really good time talking about what that would be like and why that would or would not be a good idea, but it worked out well for Hannibal. So he died in Bithynia, and he was ultimately betrayed by the people he was staying with in his villa, and the Romans were surrounding him. And at around age 70, probably in his 60s. And so he lived a long life, but he never gave up being an enemy of Rome. And this is a particularly interesting bust because it is said to have been owned by Napoleon, who greatly admired Hannibal. And actually, Hannibal's fighting tactics are tactics that are still used in military academies today because they were so brilliant, which is really interesting. A lot of the maps I was looking up for his battles when I was teaching this were military maps from military academies, which I thought was really interesting that someone was fighting over 2,000 years ago and we'd still use and look at their tactics. He was very admired by the Romans. Even though he was an enemy of Rome, he was very admired. He was called, again, the bravest of men. He was called the wisest in terms of virtue. This man, this general, this leader from North Africa outwitted and outfought the Romans. And they see him with a begrudging respect for doing that, which is really cool. And one of the greatest parts of this is it's available for free at the Dickinson College commentaries. So check it out. They're very well done. And I also have some resources I'm very willing to share. But I think that reading about a heroic and brave and intelligent general from North Africa was something that my students weren't expecting in Latin class. And it ended up being most students' favorite part of class that year, and probably the most compelling reading we did. So I really encourage you to check it out. If you have any questions, if you want me to share more resources, please feel free to reach out. I'm at Latin Tech Tools on Twitter. I'm Latin Tech Tools on Instagram. This is my website here. It has a lot of resources. Feel free to use them freely. And feel free to ask questions or ask me to share more resources at latintechtools@gmail.com. Thanks so much.